The woman let her daughter go for a bike ride in the yard, but when she went out after her just a few minutes later, the girl was already nowhere to be found. The police began searching, but they couldn't find the bicycle. This went on for 2 years until a highly unexpected turn occurred in the case. In the end, detectives finally learned the truth about her disappearance, but none of them expected that this revelation would be so shocking. Kali Ann Poulton was born on September 20th, 1989, in the American city of Rochester, New York. She was the only child in the family, so her parents gave her all their attention and love. But when the girl turned 3, they decided to divorce. Kali stayed to live with her mother, and her father maintained good relations with his ex-wife and regularly saw his daughter. The girl's mother, Judy, moved to a residential complex located in a quiet suburban area of Rochester. Despite her ex-husband helping her financially to support their child, they lived quite modestly. When the girl turned 4, her mother got a part-time job. She wanted to save up enough money for a trip to Disneyland. Judy's duties included delivering magazines to customers in their area. On the evening of May 23rd, while the woman was getting ready to go to work, she was sitting at home folding leaflets into the magazines before going out to distribute them. Meanwhile, at around 6:45 p.m., Kali asked to go out to play in the yard. It was still sunny outside, so her mother allowed her to go out briefly. She instructed her daughter to stay only in the yard and not to leave their house boundaries. Kali ran out onto the street with her bicycle. Her mother had only a few minutes left to finish with the inserts before she took the magazines to the car, intending to call Kali home. However, when the woman went outside, her daughter was not there. She looked around and called her by name, but there was no response. Judy searched the yard and then walked around the complex, but Kali was nowhere to be found. The crickets were making a noticeable noise, but it was quiet outside. With each passing second, panic engulfed Judy, and her cries quickly drew neighbors' attention. The woman asked if anyone had seen her daughter. However, only a few people saw her in the yard with other children and didn't know where she had gone. Upon learning that the girl had disappeared, neighbors joined the search efforts. But they failed to find either her or the bicycle. Most of the territory of the residential complex was covered with trees, and a fence surrounded it, separating the houses from the nearby highway. Judy was certain that her daughter couldn't have left on her own. Firstly, the girl knew she was only allowed to play in their yard, and she had never disobeyed this rule before. Secondly, Kali wouldn't have been able to ride her small bicycle far away, and she would have been noticed immediately. Fearing the worst, Judy decided to call the police. Officers arrived at the scene within minutes and immediately started searching. Firefighters and K-9 units with search dogs quickly joined them. Officers began checking every apartment and every building since they believed the girl couldn't have left the complex. If she had been abducted, suspicions fell on the residents. A stranger couldn't have entered the territory, approached the girl's yard, grabbed her, and taken her away unnoticed. In total, the complex consisted of 300 apartments, and residents willingly let the police in, sincerely wanting to help find the girl. The search continued throughout the night, and around 4 a.m., the case was transferred to a specialized unit. Detectives asked Judy if anyone in their lives could have wished them harm. They asked about Kali's father, but Judy denied the possibility of him kidnapping the girl since he regularly saw her, and there was no reason for him to do such a thing. Then the detectives asked if anyone in the complex had behaved strangely or suspiciously, and here Judy shared one observation with them. She told them that a 22-year-old man named Mark had recently moved into the complex with his wife and 1.5-year-old son. According to Judy, his behavior was very unusual and even alarming. They had seen each other in the yard several times, and they had conversations. Once, he said that her daughter was very beautiful. Judy had often heard similar words from other people. However, the tone in which Mark said it seemed strange to her. After that, he added something even more eerie. The man stated that he looked at all the little girls as beautiful. Naturally, such words seemed extremely suspicious to the mother. After that, she tried to avoid contact with Mark even more. However, they continued to occasionally see each other in the yard. Once, he asked Judy a very strange question. he inquired whether she would tell him if Kelly went far away from him. Considering such words extremely suspicious, Judy decided not to let her daughter near him again, even in her presence. During the conversation with the detectives, the woman remembered something else. About a few minutes after she went outside to search for her daughter, she saw Mark in the yard, who came out with his son to the playground. She asked him if he had seen Kelly, and the man replied no. Judy also noticed something strange, but at that moment, she didn't attach much importance to it because her mind was occupied with worrying about her daughter. She saw that his sneakers were missing laces. The detectives decided to talk to Mark and brought him to the station. The man denied any involvement in Kelly's disappearance and even agreed to take a polygraph test. The operator didn't detect any false answers, and Mark had to be released. Furthermore, Judy practically provided him with an alibi since she saw the man go out to the playground with his son at the same time she was searching for her daughter. In addition to this, the police searched his apartment in the early hours of the search, but they didn't find Kelly's bicycle or her. Thus, Mark was no longer considered a suspect, and the detectives continued their investigation without any leads. They began to check Judy for possible involvement in her daughter's disappearance. The woman understood that it was a standard procedure and repeatedly answered all their questions. However, the fact that the police, without any other suspects, spent so much time on her only intensified her suffering. Information about Kelly's disappearance appeared in local news, as well as on billboards and flyers throughout the city. The police received numerous calls with tips, the total number of which quickly exceeded 1,000. Investigators carefully examined each of them. However, all of them led to dead ends, and ultimately the case stalled for many months. Despite the lack of progress, Judy never ceased to hope that she would find her daughter alive. She was engaged in distributing flyers, contacted various media outlets, and overall made every effort to keep the case in the public eye. Compassionate people joined her, not only helping with flyer distribution but also managing to raise $100,000 offered as a reward for information. She was even invited to the popular Oprah Winfrey Show, where information about her daughter's disappearance appeared twice. Despite all this, Judy never stopped at what she had achieved. She arranged with local companies for flyers with information about the disappearance to be present in their stores. Her efforts attracted new leads, and the police investigated each of them. However, they never got closer to solving the case, and this continued for 2 years. In 1996, something extremely unexpected happened. According to his wife, she was tired of her husband's strange behavior and expressed her desire to divorce him. In response, the man began to persuade her not to do so and started to play on her sympathy, telling her how difficult things were for him. Suddenly, he confessed to his wife that he had killed Kali, then went to his father's house and called 911. Finally, she gave the police the name of her husband. It was Mark Christie, the very neighbor of Judy's. Detectives were surprised by his wife's story. However, they immediately encountered a serious problem. According to state law, any information shared between spouses is protected and cannot be used in court. Thus, the police had no right to arrest or interrogate him. Furthermore, his apartment was searched in the early hours of the investigation, and he was seen walking with his child in the yard shortly after Kali's disappearance. Despite this, Detective Crow learned that the man and his family moved out of the residential complex just a few weeks after her disappearance. The reason for this was some serious accusations. It turned out that parents of 2 girls had complained about Mark because he was naked standing in his doorway in front of them. No investigation was conducted in this case, as he was technically at his own home, and the situation didn't appear suspicious. Mark moved to another city located 8 miles away from Rochester, and Crow headed there. However, Crow encountered an unpleasant surprise. Instead of Mark, he was met by his mother, who stated that her son wouldn't talk to the police without his lawyer present, with whom they had already arranged a meeting. Apparently, Mark learned about what his wife had told the police, and Detective Crow practically resigned himself to defeat, considering that a confession made in conversation with a spouse couldn't be used in court, and the lawyer could easily prevent the police from contacting his client, so Mark would continue to live freely without fear of prosecution. However, Crow didn't rush to give up. While he was talking to Mark's mother, Mark himself eventually came out to meet him, and the detective managed to convince him that he just wanted to ask a few questions about Kali's case. Crow suggested that they drive to the nearest restaurant and have a chat over a cup of coffee. To his surprise, Mark agreed, but on the condition that the detective would take him to his lawyer afterwards. They stopped by an Italian restaurant nearby, and during this time, the detective engaged in an informal conversation with him, trying not to rush events or pressure Mark. While they were sitting and waiting for their order, Mark suddenly began to speak. He expressed regret for what he had done, stating that his actions hadn't allowed him to live peacefully over these 2 years. According to him, he constantly saw the girl in the news and on flyers, and her face haunted him everywhere. Crow continued to act with utmost caution in his investigation, and this was far from their first dialogue. Crow believed that the man took pride in the fact that he had managed to outsmart the police and evade responsibility. Therefore, the detective decided to play on his ego. He told Mark that he had indeed fooled the entire team of investigators working on the case, and this tactic proved effective. Mark didn't want to sound as if he was boasting, so he casually mentioned getting rid of the bike. It was truly genius. Mark asked the detective if he wanted to know more details. However, Crow warned him that he would only talk about the bike and nothing else. Crow maintained a soft and even friendly tone to not scare Mark off and to gather as much information as possible. He told him that he wasn't obligated to disclose anything he didn't want to. Mark then stated that Kali's tricycle had been in his apartment for days since her disappearance. He understood that the police would search every apartment in the complex without needing a warrant when a child was in danger. However, there was a loophole in the law that allowed law enforcement to search for a missing child but not for evidence. Based on this, Mark quickly disassembled the bike into pieces and hid them in different parts of the apartment that were obviously too small to fit a child. For example, he wrapped some parts of the bike in clothes and stowed them in the closets, while others he placed in small bags and carried them out to his car. Then he gradually disposed of them, taking the bags far away from home. At the exit of the residential complex, police officers inspected every car, including Mark's, multiple times, but like with the apartment, they were only looking for the missing girl, so the small bags didn't catch their attention. Listening to all this, Detective Crow understood that he had a good chance of getting Mark to talk and provide a full confession. He began telling him that perhaps the girl died not due to his fault, and it was a tragic accident. In response, Mark asked what prison sentence he could receive, and Crow replied that most likely it would be about 20 years. Mark said that it would be unfair to force him to spend half of his life behind bars, away from his wife and son. He also added that for the past 2 years, he had been living in his own personal hell. This should somehow be taken into account when sentencing. The absurdity of such words. Crow continued to adhere to his tactics and told Mark that perhaps he should alleviate his suffering and tell what really happened. The man replied that he was ready to confess everything, but only after talking to a lawyer. Of course, the detective understood that no lawyer would allow his client to confess to the crime, even if, hypothetically, he wanted to do it. He honestly told Mark about it and added that in that case, the girl's parents would never know what happened to their daughter and whether she suffered before her death. And then Mark replied, "She didn't suffer." The detective sensed that the man was ready to confess to everything. Therefore, he said that it was time to do the right thing for himself, his family, and God. Upon hearing this, Mark looked at the detective and finally admitted to what he had done. He repeated that the girl didn't suffer and immediately added that he didn't do anything to her. According to Mark, in the evening, Kali came to his apartment and asked to play with his son. The man let her in and took the girl's bicycle to the kitchen. He understood that Kali's mother would not have allowed the girl to come to his house. Therefore, he decided not to attract attention. Upon hearing Judy go out into the yard and start calling her daughter, he panicked and realized that her mother would be furious that he let the girl into his house without her permission. Therefore, Mark went up to his child's room and strangled Kali with his bare hands. Of course, Detective Crow immediately had doubts about the credibility of some aspects of this story. He also remembered that Judy had seen him on the street wearing sneakers without laces, and he thought that the man had used them when strangling the girl. This could mean that the crime was committed just as he described, and no other way. Mark tried to downplay the severity of the crime by omitting some details. However, Crow realized that if he voiced his doubts, Mark might reconsider and refuse to talk about what happened to the body. Mark stated that after all this, he took Cale's body to the kitchen and left it on the floor. Then he took his son and went out to the street to create an alibi for himself. The man continued to hear Judy calling her daughter in the yard, so he wanted to deliberately catch her eye and deflect suspicion from himself. After the woman saw him on the playground and left to search the complex territory, Mark returned home and put the girl in a laundry basket, covering her with clothes. A few minutes later, he took this basket out onto the street and placed it in the trunk. By that time, there were already many people in the yard helping Judy search for her daughter. According to Mark, there was such chaos that no one even paid attention to him, and he easily got into the car. Mark also took his son with him and drove to the company where he worked as a security guard. The man approached the back of the huge building and left the basket with Cale's body next to the door. After he toured the premises and went through the main entrance, considering that Mark had a day off, he lied to his colleagues, telling them he had forgotten some things at work that he urgently needed. This story raised no suspicions, so Mark calmly passed through the entire building and opened the back door from the inside. There, in the alcove with the tray, he found more than 100,000 liters of liquid refrigerant. He opened the top lid and dropped Kali Ann in there, first tying a heavy metal part he found nearby to her. Then he disposed of all of the victim's clothing without taking it off and returned home, where he immediately joined the search for Kali Ann with other neighbors. Thus, the man managed to remove the body from the residential complex before the police became involved, and no one noticed anything. At the end of his confession, he stated that killing Kali Ann was a big mistake and that he shouldn't have done it. Having obtained all the necessary information, Detective Crow paid the food bill, and Mark left $2 in tips. After that, he went with him to the station without resistance, where he was arrested on a charge of murder. As soon as Mark's lawyer learned of his confession, he tried to challenge and retract it, but he was unsuccessful. The man voluntarily provided all the information, and Detective Crow did not violate the law in any way. The police immediately arrived at Mark's workplace and opened the same tank 2 years later. The girl's body was still inside, though the degree of decomposition prevented experts from determining the cause of death or any other details. They confirmed Judy's identity, and she was finally able to bury her daughter. Mark pleaded guilty before the judge and was ultimately sentenced to a minimum of 25 years in prison, just as Detective Crow had anticipated. The man's lawyer managed to negotiate a deal in which his client's charges of abduction were dropped, leaving only the punishment for murder. In 2010, the police reviewed an old case from 1988 that occurred in a suburb of Rochester, where a 70-year-old woman was brutally murdered while taking a walk. Detectives found several suspects, including Mark, who was only 16 at the time. However, he passed a polygraph test during interrogation, and the operator did not detect any lies. As a result, another man named Frank Sterling was arrested for the crime. Initially, he denied his guilt, but after a night of continuous questioning, he confessed to the murder. When he was imprisoned, he attempted to appeal his sentence, claiming that the police had coerced his confession, but to no avail. Years later, in 2010, the case was reopened, and existing evidence was sent to the lab. Experts found a DNA sample from the suspect, which did not match Frank's. Instead, a full match was found in the FBI database with another inmate, Mark Christie, who was 39 at the time. He confessed to the crime but did not disclose his motives or show any remorse. As for Frank, he was released from prison after 19 years of unjust imprisonment. He sued the authorities and received nearly $10 million in 2014, but 3 years later, he died of a heart attack at the age of 54. Mark continues to serve his sentence in prison, and due to the state of New York's softened laws, he may be eligible for parole in a few years. However, there are no guarantees of his release. It is worth noting that if investigators in the Violet Wall case had not been fixated on another suspect and forced a false confession, Mark might have gone to prison earlier, and he wouldn't have had the opportunity to kill Kali Ann.